overview of what we'll be talking about today. We have an hour and a half, and we'll be presenting first an overview of forced marriage in the U.S., looking at some numbers, factors, different ways of defining and looking at this issue. Then we'll be turning to screening and response if you encounter someone who is facing this type of situation. Then we'll segue for the third portion of the webinar into an overview of legal challenges and protections associated with forced marriage, and looking at the legal system and really how it can either provide solutions and sometimes provide problems for individuals that are trying to either resist or escape a forced marriage situation. And then at the end, we'll touch on a number of policy proposals that Tahirih and some of our colleagues are pursuing as we try to think about more systemic ways to address this problem here in the U.S. I want to be sure to, welcome my colleague, Casey Swegman. Hi, everybody. Who will be presenting a portion of the webinar today. We're hoping this is going to be very conversational, not just between ourselves, but also with you. We have a lot of people who are joining us today for the webinar. We're very excited about that. And we want to encourage you to submit questions, thoughts, comments. On your GoToWebinar menu on the side, there should be a question bar where you can type in a question. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the webinar, and you should be able to, we'll take a break every 10 to 15 minutes and share some of those questions, do our best to answer them. You're, of course, as well always welcome to contact Casey or I directly. Our emails are on this front page of the webinar. We will also be sending out a PDF of the webinar afterwards, and we are recording. And so this webinar in its entirety will be viewable on our new forced marriage website shortly after the holidays. All right, so with that said, I think we should begin. We always like to start the webinar by just giving a brief overview of Tahirih. So the Tahirih Justice Center, where Casey and I are both based, we're a national nonprofit that is really dedicated to protecting courageous immigrant women and girls who are standing up and refusing to be victims of violence. And we do this through direct pro bono legal and social services. We have a very holistic approach here at Tahirih, and in addition to providing a lot of immigration-related services, our Forced Marriage Initiative, which is a newer program, also provides direct services. Our team here at Tahirih is also engaged in national, state, and local policy advocacy and a great deal of outreach and education. You can see we have offices in a number of places around the country, the Washington, D.C. metro area, Baltimore, and also in Houston, Texas. And since we've opened our doors about, I think, almost 18 years ago now, we've served about over 15,000 women and girls who have come to us seeking assistance. So briefly, I'd like to just talk a bit about the Forced Marriage Initiative, too. I know some of you on the call may be familiar with Tahirih's Forced Marriage Initiative, some may not. It is a rather unique project that is engaged in by our Tahirih staff. And it was established back in 2011. Just to give some context to this, we have been working on the issue of forced marriage here at Tahirih since our inception. Our founder, Layli Miller Moreau, was actually involved in the case of a young woman who came to the United States seeking refuge from Togo. Her name was Fauzia Kasinga, and she was facing a forced polygamous marriage and female genital mutilation in her home country. Layli was able to, along with a team of attorneys, bring her case to court to ask for refuge and protection in this country and to try and seek asylum. And this case, went through, it was a very groundbreaking case. It actually went through all the levels of the U.S. immigration court system, eventually culminating in a decision by the Board of Immigration Appeals that granted Fauzia refuge in this country if she was in detention. I mean, she really had a tough time. And one of the things that this case did is it was a precedent-setting case that established the grounds for people to be able to come and claim refuge in this country based on gender-based harm, including that of facing a forced marriage. So that's the context in which Tahirih has been doing this work for most of our tenure. We do help individuals seeking asylum who are fleeing forced marriages in their home country. We also, do assistance through other provisions under the Violence Against Women Act and Trafficking Victims Protection Act, such as getting people U visas, vow of self petitions, and we see forced marriage in those cases. For example, if someone has been brought to the United States and then forced to marry or remain in a marriage and is suffering from abuse and exploitation in that context. The Forced Marriage Initiative, though, takes a little bit different approach. We started this initiative because I'd say now about 10 years ago, we began receiving a different type of call. It was calls from young women and girls who were not needing immigration help. They were U.S. citizens. They were legal permanent residents. Maybe there were students here. They had ties, strong ties to the U.S., or the U.S. was their home, but yet they were facing forced marriages either in this country or potentially facing being taken back to often their parents' home country and facing a forced marriage there. And we didn't know what to do with these cases. They were very challenging. And we started asking around to colleagues, other service providers, and realized people didn't know what to do. We were all kind of deer in headlights with our response. And so Tahirih decided to dig a little deeper in this issue, doing research, connecting with advocates overseas, particularly in the UK and Canada, that have been working on this issue for much longer. And we realized that there was really no programming in place to help people that were really falling through the cracks of immigration service providers, traditional domestic violence service providers, shelters, things of that nature, because of the unique and often very complex circumstances involved in their cases. So in 2011, Tahirih launched this national forced marriage program. And we serve those people who are unfortunately not getting served often in a lot of other ways. We provide direct services. Casey's our frontline woman who answers calls from people all around the United States and abroad if they have a connection to the U.S. We provide safety planning, risk assessment, privacy, protection and counseling, direct legal representation and services. We liaise with the Department of State here in the U.S. as well as with hundreds of other agencies around the United States that have now been trained on this issue and that we work with. We provide technical assistance, do lots of training and outreach, coalition building. We run the National Network to Prevent Forced Marriage as well as a Forced Marriage Working Group. And we also are working very hard to develop some different policy approaches, best practices, and tools for you all to use as you're handling these cases. We also have engaged in research. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming slides. And we've embarked on some very interesting and unique projects lately too, including our Honoring Our Heartbeats, a national tour to prevent forced marriage that's actually going on right now across the United States. So let's dive into forced marriage. I think the best place to start is really with the definition. Forced marriage is a very complex issue, and there's a lot of ways to define forced marriage. We really see the crux of the definition as coming down to the issue of consent. Is the marriage that's taking place one in which one or both parties feels that they are not able to freely, fully, or some of our colleagues say enthusiastically, consent to the union that's about to take place. If they can't, if they feel that they can't, then to us it begins to segue into the territory of a forced marriage. This lack of consent can be caused by a lot of different things. Someone might be younger than the statutory age to marry. In the U.S., this varies widely. We'll talk about this state to state a little bit later in the presentation. Someone might be also subject to some kind of incapacity or disability. We've worked on cases where a family has moved forward with a marriage for someone in their family who had some severe mental disabilities and challenges. And while the family's intentions were to provide companionship, caregiving to that person was not able to fully consent. They weren't capable of fully consenting to the marriage. And the third category you see on this slide is being subject to some kind of forced fraud or coercion. And I will say that this is what we see the most frequently. Individuals who are facing anything from emotional pressure, blackmail, to more egregious forms of harm, kidnapping, being cut off financially, actual violence or threats of violence, and sometimes even death threats. We do try to distinguish forced marriage from arranged marriage, and that's a very important point to make. I always describe it as a spectrum. You know, arranged marriage can be at one end, forced marriage can be at the other, and kind of floating somewhere tangential to both of those is maybe a love marriage where no one's been involved in selecting someone's marriage partner. But circumstances can change, and someone who, say, originally agreed to an arranged marriage, as that marriage moves closer, maybe they find out things they don't like about their partner, or other circumstances change, they decide they want to pull out, but then the pressure begins, then the threats begin, and so it begins to segue closer and closer to a forced marriage situation. The same thing can happen with a marriage that starts with both partners freely selecting each other. And later, if people are unhappy, if there's violence in the union, it can, and the person doesn't feel that they have the ability to leave. And I think in most of the cases we work on, it's not just threats or violence from that partner in the marriage, but also pressure and threats from, say, their own family, surrounding community to keep in the marriage. That's when it begins to segue into a forced marriage situation. So does forced marriage really happen in the U.S.? I have to say I get this question still a lot. We've been doing this advocacy for over 3 years, and I know a lot of other individuals and organizations all around the U.S. are also doing this advocacy. But I think sometimes people still believe this is something that only happens in other countries, over there, in different cultures, different religions that they may not personally identify with. But that's not true. Forced marriage does occur here in the United States, and we think it is not an infrequent or isolated problem. In 2011, we did do a national survey that reached out to service providers, teachers, law enforcement, domestic violence advocates, tons of different people all around the United States to see what experiences they had with this issue. And we got back a lot of responses. As you can see, hundreds of people responded from almost every state in the country. And those individuals identified seeing as many as 3,000 cases of forced marriage in just the prior 2 years in their caseload. We do think that the problem is more significant than this. And as we go around doing awareness raising, doing trainings, working with people, we just keep hearing about more and more cases. That survey really documented frontline responders' experiences. You know, what we learned from the survey is, for example, only 9% of people had a definition of forced marriage they used at their agency. I think only 20% of people that responded to the survey said that they felt they would be able to handle this type of case coming through their door. And they also, you know, it's funny, we had comments and they could write down how they would handle the cases, and a lot of them said they'd be able to refer to another agency, which leads to a problem of circular referring and can just, it can be a challenge. And especially since, you know, this is a tough issue for survivors and for victims to talk about. And if they feel like they've reached out for help, been rebuffed, they may not reach out for help again. I think that's a theme that's going to run through this whole training. So with that all in mind, with the great need for more services in mind, with the need for better coordination, more education, and I think an understanding, one other quick stat to throw out that I think is so fascinating with that initial survey, 67% of the people that responded said that they felt there were hidden victims in their community that weren't being identified by their agencies or that did not know where to go. So with that said, who are these people? Who is impacted by forced marriage in the United States? You know, the survey and our own experiences here at Tahirih and of our colleagues working in this issue is that everyone is impacted. This is something that is not particular to any, you know, one country, any one region, any, you know, people of any particular religious background or cultural identity. You know, the survey that we did, respondents identified that victims' families came from at least 56 different countries. Those countries, some of the top, most frequently mentioned countries included India, Pakistan, Mexico, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, but also included places like the UK, China, Russia, El Salvador, and other countries that you might not think of when you're thinking of the issue of forced marriage. Our survey and our experience at Tahirih has also identified that people come from all different kinds of religious backgrounds. We've helped people that have been Jewish, Muslim, no religious affiliation, you know, I think the reason we like to share this information is I think it's helpful to not have a preconceived notion of who might be walking through your door and facing this issue, both to not stereotype, but also to be open to people that might need help. And it's also important to note that both men and women can be victims of forced marriage. At Tahirih, we primarily are serving women and girls, and I think we'll be talking in the context of serving women and girls during this presentation, but we've heard from men that are being forced into marriage as well, oftentimes in the context of they identify as gay, transgender, and a marriage is seen as a way to correct that behavior. And so they're struggling to grapple with issues around sexual identity and sexual orientation, as well as threats of potential violence because they're unwilling to go through with a marriage. Another point of data is the UK, which has been dealing with this issue for quite a long time, actually has a national hotline in place to help individuals facing forced marriage situations. It's run by their forced marriage unit, which is a joint effort of the Home Office and their Foreign Office. And I believe in 2013, of the hundreds and hundreds of calls that they got, about 20% related to victims that were male. So this is something that doesn't unfrequently affect men. This also is something that affects people of all ages. At Tahirih, we have worked with people that have been, unfortunately, as young as 4 or 5 and as old as in their 60s. I'd say our primary age range of people that are seeking help is probably about 16 to 25. Would you agree with that, Casey? Yeah. But again, this can affect people of all different ages, also of any different background too. I alluded to this in the introduction, but individuals can be U.S. citizens, they might be legal permanent residents, they might not have any status, and being aware of that's important. So why do forced marriage situations occur? There's a lot of answers to this. We try to look at this on a case-by-case basis and really get the individuals we're talking to explain to us what they think, what their experience has been. Family motivations really vary. They overlap, and they can fluctuate throughout the course of a case. We've worked with people where there's been very good intentions. People might have thought that the family members, their mother, their father, maybe it was their grandmother, their uncle, thought this marriage was really in the individual's best interest. It would provide them with security, companionship. We also see a lot of cases where it's kind of required by families to continue with a tradition. This is just the traditional way this has been done in the family. I was married this way, your grandmother was married this way, your grandfather was married this way. So we must continue this practice. We also hear a lot of times that it's necessary to protect the family's reputation or honor. And we can often see situations where someone may be doing something that doing a behavior the family does not agree with. So for example, dating someone and the family doesn't want them to date. So marriage is seen as a way to stop that behavior. Or maybe dating is fine, but they're dating someone that their family does not approve of outside of their, say, a different religion or a different ethnic or cultural background, or just someone they don't like. And so marriage is seen as a way of cutting that off, correcting that behavior. I'm trying to think of some other motivations, Casey, too, like if someone wants to go on to school or pursue employment or, basically have life plans that are different from what their family might be expecting.
Yeah. And to also sort of ensure the marriageability of younger siblings. It can also often be tied to the marriage of sisters and brothers who are younger than that individual, and marrying not only that individual to one person from another family, but perhaps arranging a situation in which 2 individuals from one family are going to marry 2 other individuals from a different family, and that gets even more complicated because then that individual feels the burden not only of her own, family reputation, but also does not want to jeopardize the well-being and the future of a younger sibling whose marriage may also be tied to her own.
And we'll talk a little more about that, and Casey will, when we talk about kind of what questions to ask when you're handling these cases. We also have seen situations where, say, someone who, an older sibling has resisted a marriage or left the family, and so it's become paramount for that next sibling in line to marry without any issues, without any problems, any resistance, to either kind of restore the image of the family or to make up for what that older sibling did. The bottom line, though, is, again, there's lots and lots of different reasons. We have on the survey report, which is available on our website, I think a much longer list of factors that we've seen. So I'd welcome you to visit Tahirih's website and to read the full forced marriage survey. So what kind of tactics are people facing if they are in a forced marriage situation? You know, the range is really, really huge. And just like we have a spectrum between arranged and forced marriage, we have a spectrum of tactics that can be ever-changing in a forced marriage situation. I will say usually things begin with some less violent tactics, emotional coercion. What do I mean by that? For example, a mother saying, or a father saying, you know, you will bring so much shame onto the family if you don't go through with this marriage, or I'm going to kill myself if, you know, this doesn't work out. You know, things that I think sometimes we all say, but in that particular individual's family might carry more weight or be perceived as a very serious threat or just have a big impact on that person. We also see lots of isolation and control. I know in many of the cases we've worked on, we see teenagers taken out of school if they are beginning to resist a marriage, or if there's behaviors that are not approved of by the family. Again, having that boyfriend or girlfriend, you know, pursuing a job or interest that the family doesn't approve of, getting pregnant, you know, outside of marriage, having sexual relations. So isolation and control, not only keeping someone at home, but, you know, making sure they hand over their class schedule for college and get home 10 minutes after class ends, so that the family knows they aren't going anywhere. We also see threats of social ostracism and familial ostracism. If you don't go through with this, you're going to be completely cut off from the family, from the community. No one's going to talk to you anymore, which is a really powerful thing and a powerful threat to hear. Economic threats are also very common. You'll be cut off financially, kicked out of the house. And imagine if you're a 17-year-old, particularly here in the U.S., where 17-year-olds have some rights, but not that many legal rights. They can't access shelters easily. You know, their parents still have a great deal of control over them, their decisions, their education. So being told you'll be kicked out, cut off, what does that mean? What kind of pressure does that put you under? And also we see threats of violence, not infrequently. Less common tactics, but that are not rare, include immigration-related threats. So say if someone is on a visa that's associated with their parents, or say with a spouse, that visa will get pulled. We see physical violence, sometimes severe deception, and this can include, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, you know, telling someone that something else is happening, but really as a cover for the marriage. For example, in cases of going abroad, we're going to go back home to visit your sick grandmother, but really it's going home because a wedding's been planned in that home country. Or, and this doesn't have to be just abroad, we've seen that in cases in the U.S. We're going to go travel to this place to visit X person, and the individual has no idea that this is really for a marriage, that they're going to be facing that kind of pressure when they arrive. We also have seen people being drugged, stalked, being married without their knowledge, where, you know, parents or other individuals in the family kind of contract the marriage without them being aware. So there's a lot of different things that can happen. The bottom line, though, is that these cases can be very, very high stakes. As you can see from the stats on the slide, these stats are from our forced marriage survey. Of people that talked about tactics used, almost half said that they worked with victims who are subject to actual physical violence, often severe. This includes beatings, being harm to themselves and to other people in the family. We see sometimes very effective threats being made, you know, okay, you're going to be fine, but I'm going to, you know, beat up your mother, or lock up your sisters, or have ramifications family-wide, not just for the individual at risk. And we also see people who are dealing with and encountering death threats and murder attempts. This is much more rare, but, you know, sometimes cases do escalate to that type of situation, particularly if somebody has decided to leave and to try to relocate, get to a safe location. Sometimes the response can be very violent. And as you can see, one last note, individuals that are facing forced marriage situations are often struggling with a level of despair, isolation, pressure that is really, it's hard to manage. And this leads to a lot of people sometimes actively engaging in suicidal ideation, attempting suicide, or using other coping mechanisms such as alcohol, drug abuse, cutting, other types of behaviors that may not be the healthiest for them in the long run, but it's what they're using now to cope with and go through the situation. A quick note on forced marriage and human trafficking. So I get a lot of questions about how these two things are interlinked. And I think many advocates in the trafficking community do put forced marriage into the bucket of human trafficking. We see it in trafficking reports, and I think that can definitely have its place. And there are many forced marriage situations that can fall into the category of human trafficking, especially if there's some kind of financial incentive involved. We see this in cases. I'm thinking of some of our traditional cases here at Tahirih, where someone is trafficked, to the United States and is going to be sold, or say prostituted out, or being forced to work for someone else, and they're forced to maybe marry their trafficker as a part of this bargain. So there's lots of ways this can manifest. But personally, here at Tahirih and in the FMI, we do distinguish the two things. And I think we do this because we have seen so many cases where maybe there's a dowry involved, maybe there's some kind of financial thing involved, but really that wasn't at the core of the marriage. That wasn't the overarching goal of the families in promoting the marriage. There was some other motivation. And so when you begin to get into these complex layers of motivations, to me, money doesn't make it trafficking. It can in certain cases, but not always. I do like to note, though, that trafficking resources, we have an incredibly dedicated and robust anti-trafficking community here in the U.S. It's developed a ton of amazing resources to help trafficking victims. And sometimes those can be of great use in forced marriage cases, particularly if you're working with a minor, or if you would like to get law enforcement involved. We regularly connect with Polaris, with the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. So we're getting to the end of my section. I have just a little bit more I'd like to talk about with regards to some additional research that I'd love for everyone attending this webinar to take a look at in addition to Tahirih's survey. So there's been some great research in the last 3 years that's come out. Just noting some of these great studies that you can look up and find online and or on our website. Ganga Shakti, which is a survivor-led services and advocacy organization based in New Jersey, put out an amazing study called Voices from the Front Line, Addressing Forced Marriage Within the U.S. And Vidya Sri, the advocate who wrote this study, along with researcher Durakshan Raja, she had basically taken surveys and gone around to all of these different universities and colleges that she presented on forced marriage at, and asked people to share their experiences. So this study is really reflecting, I think, students' experiences, advocates' experiences. She did stakeholder interviews as well, and it's a great thing to look at to have a little bit further understanding of how this issue manifests in the U.S. Then Satyatu Center for African Women and Families, Dr. Ramatu Bangura, engaged in a more in-depth look at forced marriage in African communities in New York City, specifically interviewing in-depth about 30 young women and girls who were engaging in a youth program through Satyatu. And she talked to them about marriage, how it intersected with their life, the pressures they were facing, whether they felt like they were being forced to marry. And so this is a much more qualitative and depth picture of how forced marriage and just issues of navigating marriage, choice of partner, can affect individuals. Then the third study, which was put out by the Asian Pacific Institute on Domestic Violence, author Chick Dobby and some amazing advocates from Wisconsin, were looking at abusive international marriage, which also includes forced marriages in the Hmong community in Wisconsin. And I would love, I think, just brainstorming for a future webinar, we need to get them on to talk a little bit more about how this issue has manifested in that community, but it's a great read. And then finally, a more in-depth look at forced marriage in South Asian communities in the U.S., written by Devjani Roy. And again, as I was noting, these can all be found with a quick Google search or on our website at Tahirih. One final note before I finish my section. Tahirih is engaged in a nationwide tour right now, honoring our heartbeats, a tour to end forced marriage in the U.S. It's been going on since this fall. We kicked off in New York City in September and visited Houston, San Francisco, and New Jersey just two weeks ago now. And we will be continuing on in Chicago, January 21st to the 23rd, and then rounding out this tour in DC, March 17th to the 19th. And this tour is really an incredible moment to I think raise the voices of survivors and of, as they call themselves, artivists, who are really sharing their experiences with issues of forced marriage. This image that's on the slide right now is from this amazing comic book called Heartbeats, the Is It Project, that was put together by Pomegranate Tree Group, which is a group of activists, artists, counselors, advocates from Toronto, Ontario. And they wrote this incredible graphic novel that explores issues of family violence, forced marriage, racism, colonization. And the stories are all told from the perspective of South Asian community, and which is where the authors come from. And we're so excited to have been able to do a run of this comic book for the U.S., for a U.S. audience with U.S. resources in the back. And so please do let us know. You can reach out to Casey or I directly if you're interested in getting copies of this comic book, or I would definitely encourage you to come to one of the 2 remaining Heartbeats Tour events. Our DC finale should be shaping up to quite a celebration you know, of this amazing work by these artists, and I think a special moment to really engage in some more in-depth discussions about how to address this issue here in the United States. I noticed we had a few questions coming in, so let's turn to those for a second. One person was asking if there's some underlying economic reasons that a daughter or son might be forced into marriage. And I will say, yeah, we have definitely seen cases where economics have been a huge part of it. And again, that to me can move the needle more into the trafficking realm. I'm thinking back to a couple of cases we've had. I was working on a case involving 2 sisters who were potentially going to be married overseas, and the reason for the marriage was there was a land dispute between their father and their uncle, and the dispute was being worked out, but the marriage was seen as a way of kind of solidifying and really resolving that land dispute. And so when the sisters resisted this marriage, it had real reverberations throughout the family. And there, you know, the marriage wasn't, there could have been best interest, you know, rationale behind it as well, but really it was economic. It was to resolve this land dispute, resolve some outstanding monetary issues. So we do see that. And, you know, we have unfortunately also seen situations where parents or other kind of power-holding members of a family have sold individuals into marriage for, you know, a great deal of money. And again, that begins to cross the line into trafficking for me. We also sometimes see immigration motivation. You know, individuals who, particularly if they're U.S. citizens, might be forced to go abroad, marry someone abroad, and then come back to the U.S. and sponsor that person to come to the, you know, to this country for whatever opportunity they are desirous of getting. And to me, that sometimes can also cross the line into trafficking situations where what's wanted is that visa. It's not anything around the marriage. It's an end goal is financial, it's a visa, it's some other tangible benefit, and that's important to be aware of. Another question that we got was regarding whether it's common or if many of the cases that we see involve victims of rape being forced to marry their perpetrator. And I do think that that is something that's not uncommon. Rape, and I will also say child abuse. We see often some of the clients that we're working with have been abused as children or as teenagers, and when their family finds out about that abuse, marrying them off is kind of a way to maybe not cure the abuse, but to be sure that they're married and taken care of before the stigma of being a sexual assault or a child abuse victim gets out into the family, to the community, and kind of ruins their prospects for marriage.
Yeah, and we don't see these cases as often as we do the other, you know, kinds of dynamics that we've talked about already, but we did receive a call from somewhere in the United States where an individual was being pressured to marry her actual rapist. And so we have seen those case dynamics, although not as common as other dynamics that we deal with.
And I think it's important to note, too, that sometimes you won't find out about that until you have been working for a long time with the individual. I've had that personally happen in my cases here at Tahirih, where, you know, someone's not comfortable sharing their experiences of sexual assault, child abuse with you. They're trying to grapple with their immediate needs in the moment, which is to resist this marriage, to get to a place of safety, and then explore their options and be able to move on with their lives. So at this point, I am excited to hand it off to Casey to be talking a little bit more about screening for and responding to forced marriage situations. Again, Casey is really our frontline person at Tahirih. If you are grappling with a forced marriage situation in the work that you do, I would encourage you to reach out to her directly to kind of begin our services and intake process. So with that, Casey, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Heather, and great job on the first portion. Heather will be back with you after my section. And again, please feel free to chime in with questions. I'll try and answer them as we go along. And so I'm just going to be talking about, you know, what is the typical Tahirih case that we see. And I would say typically by the time someone has decided to reach out to us either via email or on the phone, they're really in a position of what we call decision paralysis. And they really are at a point where they don't know if they want to stay and acquiesce to the marriage, if they want to stay and continue to try to negotiate and resist, or if they're at a point that they just can't take it anymore and need to leave. And that decision paralysis can be a really difficult thing to work through initially, because they're really thinking about so many things and weighing the pros and cons of so many different scenarios in their mind. In particular, you know, as Heather talked about previously, they have oftentimes experienced a very high level of isolation, and that can lead to a really constrained sense of options. Maybe they have no work history. Maybe they've really never been able to travel outside of the home on their own, so the idea of even taking a bus or taking a taxi or going to the airport can seem really overwhelming and really daunting, let alone going to a shelter or going to live in an apartment on your own. There's also all of those fear of consequences to themselves. You know, what will be the consequences if they say no but remain in the home? What will be the consequences if they say yes? What will be the consequences if they say no and leave the home? And not only for themselves, but for the siblings and, you know, potentially their mother or father that they leave behind. And it's really important to explore all of that with them so you understand what they are really sort of weighing in their mind. And also a lot of times we're working with individuals who really have a very, very, you know, limited understanding of their actual rights and the U.S. laws that pertain to them and the resources in their particular area that could be of assistance to them. So it's really important during that initial conversation to inform them right away that forced marriage is illegal in the United States and there are resources out there to help, and that, you know, we'll talk a little bit later about the fact that no religion sponsors forced marriage or promotes forced marriage. So those can be really important things to share with someone, you know, right when you talk to them. And I think it's also important when you're doing, you know, your sort of initial safety planning, your initial intake that, you know, most places have in place. You know, everyone sort of does intake and screening differently, but in a forced marriage case, it's really important to include a really detailed exploration of where the threat is coming from, because in your typical family violence situation or your typical domestic violence situation, we're often dealing with intake and screening tools that identify one single perpetrator. But it's really important in these cases to understand that the threat can be from so many sources. It can be from all of the nuclear family that's in the home with them. It can be from relatives and community members that are in the country but not necessarily even in the same state. It can also be from individuals living outside of the country. We worked on cases where there's a very powerful and influential grandmother or uncle who lives overseas, and they're really the decision makers in the home.
And often the parents are feeling pressure and kind of threats to acquiesce to that decision maker.
Exactly. You know, I had a client actually part of her decision paralysis was not understanding where her father's loyalties really were, because she would hear snippets of conversations on the phone where he would be saying, she's my daughter and I'll do what I want, but she didn't know if that meant, no, I'm not going to force her into marriage, and the person on the other end of the phone was pressuring him, or if the person on the other end of the phone was trying to convince him not to force her into marriage and he wanted to. And it turned out that he didn't want to, and the pressure was coming from outside. It was coming from a higher level within the family that was putting that pressure on him. And so, our clients are really dealing with a very confusing and difficult information that's coming in from all different angles. And so understanding and mapping that out, actually mapping out who are all the important players in a situation, is going to be key to effective safety planning and understanding where your client is coming from. We're also going to touch on this a little bit later, but the urgency of these cases can often be extremely high, particularly by the time they get to Tahirih. They sort of see us as a last resort and can be facing imminent travel abroad, sometimes as soon as 2 days from the day that they've contacted us. And that can be a really difficult situation. But again, we reiterate this later on, but our first line of defense in those cases is not to travel overseas. And we'll go a little bit more into detail as to why that is so important to reiterate to individuals, letting them know that, of course, if they do choose to, we will safety plan with them. But for a number of reasons that we'll talk about later, it is really not advantageous to travel overseas if there is even a hint that a forced marriage might be waiting for someone there. We also see individuals calling us that are in a reluctant sponsor scenario, which Heather touched on briefly. And those are the situations where a U.S. citizen has been forced into marriage or is facing a forced marriage for the purposes of filing a fiance or a spousal visa for someone to join them in the United States and get that person on a path to citizenship. And the most complex cases, I think, that me and Heather deal with are cases involving minors. And at Tahirih, we're very lucky in that we are not mandated reporters, so we are able to work on these cases very in-depth and involve CPS or the police when it's deemed necessary and when we know it will be more beneficial to the client and less harmful. Cases involving minors are extremely complicated given the emphasis on parental rights in the United States and just such a lack of resources for those individuals. And because we are sort of short on time on this webinar, we took out some information about your typical warning signs and sort of red flags that we see in forced marriage cases. And sometimes people are calling us and they aren't 100% sure that their family is planning a forced marriage. Or a teacher is calling us on behalf of a student that they're working with, and there's something strange going on, but they can't quite identify what it is. And I would say, a couple of those key warning signs, particularly for anyone working with youth that we've seen, are individuals who are afraid of upcoming breaks, afraid of holiday breaks. So around this time, I will tell you, I'm getting a huge uptick in calls and outreach for individuals who have told their friends or told a teacher that they don't think they'll be returning to school after holiday break, or that they're afraid of this trip that's been planned over holiday break because they think a marriage is waiting for them. The same applies to summer break. So that is a really important red flag and warning sign to be aware of. We've also talked to teachers who are working with students who have always been straight A students, and all of a sudden their attendance plummets. They're absent a lot. Their parents are keeping them out of school for weeks at a time with no real rational excuse as to why. And that can be a huge red flag as well, and that also applies to employment.
Yeah, these things can be translated across to situations in someone's employment. There's also some different warning signs that medical professionals could look at too. I think anything that kind of indicates someone might be isolated, like, for example, couple examples across different practices. A student's trying to talk to a school counselor, but their sibling or someone else is insisting on, coming with them at any point. Parents insisting on being at, doctor's visits for the whole time, which, again, out of context might seem just like normal behavior or not something to raise a flag, but I think when you start to put a bunch of these different kinds of warning signs together, it might lead to there being a forced marriage situation.
Asking yourself if that individual is ever given the chance to speak with an advocate or speak with someone in complete isolation, just on their own. And if the answer is always no, if there's always someone monitoring them, whether or not they seem benevolent, that can be a red flag for these types of situations.
And I'd love to just give a plug for a great manual that was put out by our partners, some of our colleagues in the UK, by the Forced Marriage Unit actually. They have a great multi-agency practice guidance that is available at the Forced Marriage Unit's website. And they have a good graphic. It's like a chart that shows some of these intersecting warning signs and what people in different sectors should be looking for. So that's the basis, I think, of our analysis when we started doing this work back a number of years ago, and it's still a great tool.
Yeah, and of course that family history. If a person's had siblings who have left school or left work earlier unexpectedly for a marriage, that is also a really important red flag to be looking out for. So a lot of times, people ask us, well, how do you respectfully ask someone if they're facing a forced marriage situation? And I think, this was also something that we discussed here amongst our Tahirih staff members when someone's calling our front line and isn't using that term, because a lot of times that's not the way that they define their situation. Those aren't the words that they would use, and it can take some time for them to be comfortable using that term, and they may never be comfortable using that term. And so we don't want to come right out and just say, so are you facing a forced marriage situation? Because that can have a real chilling effect on the individual that you're talking to. And so, we've had a lot of great discussions around this on our Heartbeats tour with advocates all across the country. And I think the number one takeaway that people have is really just approaching it the same way that you would approach a friend who's maybe just recently gotten engaged and asking questions about their engagement. So how did you meet each other? Tell me about the engagement story. And then if, red flags are popping up, interesting ways to get to sort of the crux of the situation are, well, can you tell me about how marriages have taken place in your family in the past? Do you feel you have a choice as to whom you marry or when you get married or whether you get married at all? Because maybe the person is acceptable, but I don't want to get married at the age of 18. I'm certainly happy marrying that person, but I'd really like to do so after college. But family's going to say, no, you can't go to college. You're going to get married, and then you'll be a housewife. And so it's really asking, what is their involvement in the marriage process, and how are things moving forward?
And I think keeping things open-ended is also a tactic that we use. The more open-ended and less pointed the questions, even something as basic as asking, what are your kind of upcoming future plans? What would you like to be doing, whether it's related to school, career, just any kind of pursuit? Sometimes opening that door and putting yourself out there as someone who's an open listener will get people talking about things that are, troubling them, weighing on them, concerning to them. I think that's the tactic that we use when we're doing our intake, when we're doing our screening, and just when we're beginning to have a conversation with someone who, maybe is saying, I'm facing a forced marriage. We still try to keep it very open and keep it, give them control over the flow of the conversation.
And so in terms of responding, obviously this is a 101, and there's so much more to share about how to respond to cases of forced marriage, which is why we have down here, first and foremost, if you are working with a case or you think you might be working with a case of forced marriage, please feel free to reach out to us at any time for technical assistance and to find out about resources in your area. We're more than happy to help on any case across the U.S. And any case involving a citizen or a U.S. individual overseas. But the very basic guidelines that we like to share is, first and foremost, reassure the individual you're working with of your confidentiality. And if there are limits to that confidentiality, you have to explain them really upfront. In particular, when you're working with minors, this is really important because I think as we're learning more and more, CPS at this point, their protocols are not necessarily always designed with a forced marriage case in mind. And sometimes reporting to CPS can do more harm than good depending on their response protocols and the place where you are. And we have seen cases of someone sharing something with an individual who was a mandated reporter and then CPS visiting that home, and that alerts the family that that individual has reached out for help. And unfortunately, in one of these cases, that individual was taken out of the country the very next day, and the entire family disappeared, and we never saw that individual again. So it's really important to make sure that the limits and the constraints of your confidentiality are out on the table. And again, Tahirih is always here to help and provide technical assistance, particularly in those cases involving minors. Again, one of the first and most important things to do is to reassure the individual that they do have the right to say no to the marriage and that no religion sanctions forced marriage. I like to tell the anecdote that I actually had a 17-year-old who had memorized the Quran from front to back and used quotes from that text to negotiate and debate with her father and her uncles. So religion can really be a protective factor, and I think a lot of individuals are facing a situation where if they want to resist or say no to a forced marriage, they feel like they are being told that they are also rejecting and resisting their religion. But religion can really be a protective factor because we've been told across the board by religious scholars, Islamic religious scholars, Jewish religious scholars, Christian scholars, that this is in none of these texts do they sanction forced marriage or promote forced marriage as an acceptable practice. And that can be a really empowering thing for someone to hear, that they do not have to reject their faith just because they are rejecting a forced marriage. And again, just really important to keep in mind, some individuals do want to be screened or assisted by an individual who is from their same immigrant or cultural or ethnic background, and some individuals do not. And if that's a luxury you have as an agency to ask what that individual's preference might be, we really encourage you to explore that with the individual because that can really impact the trust and the rapport that a case manager and advocate is able to establish with a service seeker. So when screening for forced marriage situations, it's really important also, and I think a lot of us have probably heard this in our work previously, but particularly in these cases where there is that really large web of potential perpetrators who may appear benevolent or as false allies, it's important if you're working with a non-English speaker to never use family or community members as interpreters. Even in those situations where getting an interpreter on the phone or getting an interpreter in person seems almost impossible, that is always going to be to the benefit of your client to go that extra step and get that interpretation from a non-involved party. It's also really important never to share information without the individual's express consent. I like to give an example of a client I was working with who we realized that she had a cousin who was actually a domestic violence advocate at an agency in another state. And our first instinct was to involve her and reach out to her. And then exploring that more with the service seeker, we realized that that individual's loyalty to her family would trump her loyalty to her work, and that sharing information with her would actually put the client in greater risk. And so really exploring who is an appropriate party to share information with and who is not. One of the really important things that the UK really drives home, as do our colleagues in Canada, and we do as well, is remembering the one chance rule and never sending an individual away or returning them to their family or their perpetrators against their wishes. That one phone call, that one time that they stop by your office, that one email that you get could be that only opportunity that that individual has to reach out.
And that's not to say you can solve everything at that initial conversation or with that first phone call, but if the person doesn't get some kind of response,
right.
And sometimes situations are very, very urgent that might need some triaging, it can be a loss of a lifeline for that person,
yeah.
A loss of that one opportunity to get help.
Yeah, and if you're not a 24-hour helpline, which Tahirih also is not a hotline, making sure they at the very least have those resources given to them, when they do reach out for help, so that if they find themselves in an emergency situation and your agency or our agency cannot help,
mm-hmm.
That they have the referrals to agencies that might be able to help.
Mm-hmm.
And again, being really careful about who you approach in terms of involvement in the case. We have clients who have listed individuals, a benevolent uncle or aunt or cousin who they really feel has been on their side and is supporting them and is offering resources, and then down the line it turns out that that individual was under so much pressure also from the family that they were actually feeding information back, and they were a false ally really to that individual, and that really set us back in our work. So making sure to really explore all of that in great detail can be very time-consuming, but also incredibly necessary in these cases. And this last bullet here is really something that we as Tahirih we follow as a rule. We do not act as mediators. We're not a grassroots community-based organization that is, entrenched in one particular community and can go in and mediate a situation between uncles and dad and a daughter. That is not the role that we play. That's not the expertise that we have. But that being said, there are organizations that do that work, Sauti Yetu being one of them. Tahirih had mentioned them previously. So it's not to say that that work can't be effective. It's just to say that, making sure that if, that's your approach, that's where your expertise lies. So in terms of safety planning and mapping out family history and networks, I think I touched on this briefly already, but it's really important to, at Tahirih we actually map it out sometimes. It can be so complicated that we visually map out who's involved, who's putting pressure on the survivor, who does she see as an ally and why, and again, saving proof of threats or abuse. I'm sure as a lot of DV advocates, you know that this will be really important down the line if something like a protection order or any sort of court action is necessary. We will say that most of our clients do not want the courts involved at all. They do not want to take legal action against their family for the most part. But if it may be necessary down the line, saving proof of those threats or abuse, Facebook messages, whatever it might be to make the case for a protection order will be really important. So emphasizing, trying not to delete those right away until you've saved some level of proof. So assessing the risk. One of the most important questions we ask our clients is, what are your gut instincts? What is going to happen if you say no to the marriage? What's happened when mom or your older sister or your older brother has said no to prescribed family behavior in the past? Does it mean a giant verbal argument is going to ensue, but eventually the dust will settle and you can move forward? Or does it mean, severe physical abuse is going to happen? We might have a lot of assumptions about what's going on in these family dynamics, but the individual you're working with is the one who really knows what risks she's facing in regards to what types of steps she wants to take. Again, just really exploring with her what if she's caught planning. So what if she doesn't verbally ever say no to her family, but in secret she is saving money, or she's bought bus tickets, or she's put in other safety planning mechanisms in place for herself. And what if she is caught doing that? What are the consequences for that? Are they going to take away all of her communication, take away her phone? What would be her plan to communicate with advocates moving forward if she was caught and that phone was taken away and that computer access is taken away? Making sure to plan for all contingencies in these types of cases. In particular, in the very high stakes cases, we've gone so far as to say, if I don't hear from you for a 2-week time span, do you want me to call the police? Do you want me to call CPS? If you're taken overseas and I don't hear from you for 2 weeks, do you want me to call the State Department? And making sure we have those triggers in place if communication is cut off.
And these questions that are listed here and in the preceding and following slides are really things that we'd love for you to tack on to your typical intake, risk assessment, safety planning tools that you have at your own agency, specifically for a forced marriage situation. Because these are sometimes the deeper level questions and more nuanced questions that are critical in these types of situations, particularly given the risk of sometimes overseas travel or flight.
Yep. And someone did ask about contact information for agencies that can help after hours. And yes, you can find the information on the Tahirih website, and I will say that the Forced Marriage Initiative will be launching an independent website very soon in the new year, we hope, in the month of January. And on that website will also be more resources for individuals who might be needing emergency assistance outside of regular office hours.
And at Tahirih, we are not a hotline or a 24-hour agency, but we are a help center and in some ways a helpline for this issue. And I know Casey and I are always checking our email, as are many advocates out there in this connected age.
So one of the most important conversations that I can have with my clients is really identifying and exploring with them what their strengths are and what their wishes are for their future. And a lot of times, this can be the first time that they've been given the space to do that. And reminding them of all of the incredible things that they've already accomplished, and that, you know, we're not here to be their savior, but they already have all the strength and resources that they need to get themselves to where they want to be. And where they want to be might be very different than where you think they should be. And as an advocate, being comfortable with that and being comfortable with second guesses and going backwards and really being there for them throughout their decision-making process. Some of the things, you know, we like to highlight are any accomplishments or skills, education-related connections and achievements that they've made, any assets like savings. A lot of times by the time clients get to me, they've already set up their own personal bank account and have been tutoring on the side or doing some sort of small side job to set themselves up to be in a position to have some level of resources. And that is a brilliant move that they've often come up with on their own, and to be reminded of that is really important. And again, just really asking them, you know, what do you want? If this forced marriage wasn't on the table, how do you see yourself in the future? Where do you want to go? And what steps can we help you take? What options can we help you outline to get you to where you want to be personally and professionally?
There was a question that came in asking if there are any specific agencies that are working with LGBTQ survivors that are you know, facing forced marriage situations. I don't think there's any specific agency that's dedicated to that. I will say that many agencies, Tahirih included, that work on the issue of forced marriage do have, you know, training and sensitivity to handling LGBTQ issues. You can definitely, you know, contact us if there's someone in particular you're working with, and we can, you know, look for appropriate agencies in that area. I think there are a lot of, you know, synergies across lots of different service sectors, and this is one where we do think it's important because we've had, you know, a number of clients, and I know that other agencies have seen this phenomenon too, where marriage is a tool. Mm-hmm. It's a tool to try and I use air quotes around this, correct someone's sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and it's something we all need to be aware of, particularly as that piece of the puzzle may not be initially shared with you when someone's coming to you for help. So it may take a little bit of time, a little bit of trust to be built up before that piece is included as part of the information you're given.
So, you know, sometimes you do get to the point with a client who does need to relocate and is going to make that choice to leave the family home or leave the marital home. And there is a lot of safety planning that goes into these types of situations. And we ourselves at Tahirih continue to work with experts at the Safety Net Project on relocation because it is so risky and it is a really tricky thing to accomplish safely, while also protecting someone's privacy and making sure that their new location remains private and does not get discovered by their perpetrators or individuals who are looking for them. And so these are just some, you know, 4 key bullet points to keep in mind when you're working with someone who's thinking about relocating, but we really encourage you to reach out for technical assistance on these types of cases because, you know, little things like choosing the safest mode of transportation can be really complicated.
We've had cases, I'm thinking even of a case that we had where if, you know, an individual was potentially going to fly somewhere else to get to a different state, to get to a safe location, and family members had actually, you know, called airlines. Asked, is this person, you know, did they have a ticket booked? And of course they can check the name. There's no safeguards in place for protecting your information or identity.
Airlines are very quick to just give out people's information if you have their first and last name. So safer modes of transportation can be something like a bus, because sometimes you don't even need an ID to get on a bus. You can buy a bus ticket with cash, and it's a lot harder to trace someone if they're taking a bus. And a car is often, you know, something a survivor really wants to take with her, but it can be the easiest way to be tracked. If you're not sure if there's a lien on the car, if you owe money on the car, if there's a GPS installed on the car either by the dealership or by a perpetrator.
Someone else is on the title.
There are so many ways that a vehicle that someone might think is solely theirs can be tracked that it really is, you know, one of the least safe methods of relocating. Really important now is advising on the risks of using mobile technology during and after a relocation. You know, I want to leave enough time for Heather, but just keeping in mind all the different ways that a smartphone, a tablet, a computer, anything that has GPS running in the background, even if you turn off the phone, we've been told at this point malware, malicious software that tracks your whereabouts can continue to run, even if a battery has been removed from a phone. So there is a lot of safety planning that needs to go around mobile technology, but the bottom line is we would never tell someone that they must leave a phone behind. If a phone is something that they feel they need to keep safe, then we can safety plan around that, and we can explore different ways. If it's the information on the phone that they need, there are ways to safely remove it from the phone, clean it from any malware or malicious software, and then install it on a new phone, and that can be the safest way to address that issue. But please do be in touch with you know, an expert in relocation if you are working on a case where someone is going to be leaving the home. And always planning for a perpetrator's response. In particular, is there a need to contact the police proactively if the family or community is going to present to police and report the person as missing, and enlist the police's help in finding that individual? And so what we typically do when we know someone's going to relocate without warning is to proactively reach out to our contacts at the local police department and let them know that this person has left of their own free will for their own safety, and if they're reported missing, simply deny knowledge of the case and tell the individuals you won't be filing a report.
And you know, we had a question come through asking if there's issues where shelters, other agencies, maybe you're not equipped to deal with individuals facing forced marriage. And the bottom line is yes. I mean, I think a lot of agencies, a lot of law enforcement units, a lot of shelters will struggle with these cases because we are mainly geared towards responding to intimate partner violence situations. That's where most protocols nowadays in the domestic violence and sexual assault community are kind of set up around, right? With forced marriage situations, because the perpetrators are oftentimes the family members of the victims, you know, in more of a nuclear extended family type scenario, because there's multiple perpetrators, you know, and do you plan on having, you know, cousins potentially tracking your movements and seen as a potential threat? Like, it adds a lot of layers to safety planning and a lot of complexity to response in these cases. And, you know, there's also the constant pressure, too, that I think survivors feel, whether self-imposed or otherwise, to want to circle back and still be in touch with these people. That, you know, many of the survivors that we've worked with have been incredibly conflicted. They want the marriage to stop, but they still love and care for their family members. They love and care for the people that are putting pressure on them around this marriage situation. And so balancing that as an advocate, thinking about, well, maybe right now where things are kind of at a very high stakes moment, we need to cut all communication, but let's plan for in the future a safe way for you to send a letter, be in contact, you know, with someone. You need to keep that in mind, and it does add an extra layer of challenge in providing services, and that's what we're here to help with technical assistance or direct support for individuals themselves.
And just a note on remembering to always take a survivor-centered approach. I think a lot of times as advocates, we think we know in our mind, you know, she should just leave. She's just got to get out of there, because a forced marriage, what is it going to lead to? I mean, honestly, what we see down the road is the forced consummation of that marriage.
Forced pregnancy.
Yeah, forced pregnancy and things like that. But it is not our job to tell an individual what they should do. It's our job to just explore options with them and help them figure out what will be best for them in the long run, keeping in mind that a lot of these individuals will be leaving the only home they've ever known, lacking in life experience, and fearing for their siblings, their friends, and their pets, and feeling really conflicted. So it's really important in these cases, as I think it is, you know, with TV cases too, to be prepared for second thoughts and backtracking on decisions. You know, down to the, you know, the day you've bought the plane ticket for the survivor, you've got the entire plan in place, and that morning you get a text that says, you know, it's off, I can't do it today. And just being prepared for that to happen and to support her and to be there for her after the fact. You know, at Tahirih, you can fall off the grid, come back on the grid. there is no 8-month, 1-year, 2-year timeline with which I can work with individuals. We'll work with them until their needs are met, and that's something, that we have the luxury of at Tahirih, and, we hope that many agencies will start taking that kind of approach as well with these kinds of cases. I think Heather touched on this briefly already, but really planning for that emotional response that's going to happen if someone does decide to leave the home. And what we've seen in our cases is it is that emotional abuse. It is that emotional blackmail that really, tempts our clients to return to an abusive situation. Mm-hmm. And so preparing for that response can be a really helpful tool for individuals. So listing out all the different ways that a family or individual could respond to you leaving home. What happens if they send really hateful emails, text messages or Facebook messages, or leave you really, really mean voicemails? How is it going to make you feel, knowing what that's going to make you feel, and how are you going to remind yourself all of the reasons why you decided to leave? And also preparing for no response, because that's something that I think a lot of clients are unprepared for. What if you leave and your family doesn't try to find you? That's going to hurt in a very different way than all of these hateful text messages and voicemails. And being prepared for that is also going to be really important.
They're also, and we've seen this very frequently, very loving, very pleading responses that individuals will get after they leave, saying that everything will be called off, that they never wanted things to get to this point, that they didn't understand this was such a huge issue. So there's so many different types of responses that someone could encounter, and it can be an emotional roller coaster ride, particularly in the hours and days, and I'd even say the first couple weeks after someone chooses to leave that family or that pressure-filled situation and get to a place of safety.
Yeah, definitely. And so just a brief note on safe communication. One of the first things we tell clients is to set up a new anonymous email account with which to contact advocates. An email account that no one knows about and you've never logged into, like a shared computer or a shared phone or any device using that email account, so we can communicate safely. There's also information up here about an IP masking program. If you're interested in learning more about that, we're happy to assist you. Feel free to reach out to us. And again, we touched on the issue of smartphones being hacked really easily, and really exploring whether or not that phone that they think is just theirs is actually just theirs, because if it's on a family plan, who's going to see the bill? They're going to see who you're calling. If you relocate, they can see where the calls are originating from. There's a lot of things that tech-savvy families can do to trace someone, so really exploring all of that technology. And again, that's something we can provide technical assistance on, and there's also a great expert that we work with that can go even more in depth on those types of things. And again, the use of social media is a really big issue in these types of cases. We've heard from a colleague that she worked on a relocation with one of her clients, and the day that she safely relocated, the entire time she was tweeting and Facebook messaging about it. I'm on the train, I'm headed here, I'm with my friend, and obviously that completely blew her cover. So keeping all of this in mind, it's a new world. We're working with a totally new dynamic with our clients who are so young and so tech-savvy, and really exploring all of that. And there's a great guide from NNEDV about privacy and safety on Facebook. They actually worked with Facebook to create that guide. It's not foolproof, but it can be really helpful if you're working with a client who does want to remain on Facebook and wants to try and do so as safely as possible. Again, more resources about computers and tablets. And just a quick note about not using a change of address form as you're instinctually trained to do if you do move. There's a lot of risks involved in that, including your new mail being routed to your old home with that yellow sticker that has your new address on it, alerting anyone who is in your old location to where you've moved. And there are workarounds to this. Right now there's no protocol in place, but Heather is an expert in working with the Postal Service to
say that, but
try and get around these automatic procedures that are in place currently that typically don't cause anybody any problems.
And address confidentiality programs can be huge tools to use, in these types of cases, just as they would be in intimate partner violence or other family violence cases.
And another quick note just about identity change. A lot of our clients think, well, I'll just change my name and get a new social security number, and then no one will ever be able to find me. And our go-to response is that identity change is an incredibly complicated process. Getting a new Social Security number is practically impossible at this moment in time. It is something that Heather and our legal staff are working on, but it's a very high level burden of proof to try and get a new Social Security number. And even with a name change, that becomes public record unless you're working with a very skilled attorney who knows how to file things under seal. And even then, your old name is on your birth certificate, and then your new name is amended on your birth certificate. And the only people who can request your birth certificate are yourself and your parents. And so if they're trying to track you down and they request your birth certificate, they'll see the name that you legally changed to right there on the birth certificate. So your new identity and your old identity are always going to be linked. And so that can be an important part of a safety plan, but it's only one part. In and of itself, it does very little to protect someone's privacy. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about forced marriage overseas and the risks of traveling abroad before I pass it back to Heather. But again, just emphasizing how difficult it is going to be to reach out for help if you travel overseas and you're facing a forced marriage situation. A lot of times clients are taken to places where they don't know the language or the dialect. They have limited access to email, and when they do have access, it is monitored. Someone is over their shoulder or tracking their emails that they send and receive. A lot of times the minute they touch the ground in the country that they've been taken to, their passports, their ID documents, their money, their phone are all taken away for safekeeping. I don't want you to lose it while we're here. We'll give it back to you. And then even if they are reaching out for help, everything that they would need to prove who they are and get assistance is now not in their possession. A lot of times they're taken to remote areas. A lot of my clients say, well, if I get into trouble, I'll just get a taxi and I'll get to the airport. But getting a taxi in a lot of the places where clients are going is near impossible and also very risky. And what if you're taken to a place like Saudi Arabia where a female traveling alone in a taxi is actually illegal? Lack of protections under law, lack of resources and shelters on the ground. All of these things are really important to be very transparent and upfront about with a client who may be facing travel overseas, because at the very least they'll have all the information, and giving them even just a piece of paper with your name, your contact information, Tahirih's contact information, the phone number and email for American Citizen Services at the closest embassy or consulate, written on a piece of paper and stuffed somewhere safely. I mean, honestly, our go-to really is somewhere where no one would look, like your bra or in the bottom of your shoe, so that they have it. Because if they program it into their phone or save it on their computer, then if that computer or that phone is taken away, they won't have the information, and it's also highly likely that someone will see that they've reached out for help.
Here's a list of just some of those recommendations that we have if someone's facing travel overseas. We're here to go a little bit more in depth with you on these. We can do that offline. But these cases are tough. We've been lucky enough to work with some outstanding allies, including the law firm of Mayer Brown and Caterpillar Corporation, who've done some really in-depth research into systems, protections, laws, exit controls overseas in many of the countries that we've seen individuals taken to for forced marriage situations. So please do reach out to us, and we can help you kind of think through those cases.
Yeah, and just two more things I would emphasize are that it's important to let an individual know that a marriage that takes place overseas that is legal in the place in which it occurred is recognized by the United States. A lot of clients think that, well, it's just a marriage in Guatemala, so when I come back to the U.S., it's not going to count. But if it's recognized by the government of Guatemala, it's recognized by the government of the U.S. And there are limits to what the State Department can do if you are overseas. And a lot of times clients think, the Navy SEALs will come in if they call the State Department and rescue them. But that is really not the case, and you need to be very honest with them about that.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think we as advocates have the obligation and the job of trying to force people to be realists when they're considering different options, when they're considering whether to travel or not. So we have about 15 minutes left, less than that, about 10 minutes left. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the current legal framework in the U.S. and then end this presentation talking a little bit about some of the policy positions that Tahirih is pursuing in order to address forced marriage here in the U.S. at a more national, systemic level. So jumping right into that, what is the current legal framework right now in the United States? At the federal level, we don't have any forced marriage specific criminal laws outlawing the practice. This isn't actually that unusual. I mean, most laws related to marriage, related to violence, to services, to protections are under the state's purview. So with our federal state division, you know, this isn't that unusual, but it is something that we don't have at the national level. Looking at federal agencies, the State Department, I think, is the one real federal agency that has you know, done some work on the issue of forced marriage. They have some information in their training materials, in the Foreign Affairs Manual, protocols they follow, talking about how to handle forced marriage cases. They have some guidance regarding both adults and minors, and how officers posted at different consulates and embassies around the world can assist individuals. You know, it really varies country by country, I will say. You know, we've worked with the State Department posts all over the world on these types of cases and gotten varying responses depending on particular officers, the particular circumstances in that country at the time. You know, if someone's facing a forced marriage in Afghanistan and is not in Kabul, it can be very hard for them to get anywhere near the embassy in Kabul, or for anyone that works in the U.S. Embassy there to travel anywhere outside of a very, very tiny safe zone in order to try and provide them with assistance. You can't do a welfare and well-being check in that country, which sometimes the State Department will try to do, say if someone's reporting is missing traveling overseas. We have really enjoyed engaging with dialogue with state, though, and look forward to continuing to include them as we move forward on this issue here in the U.S. They're the main federal agency, though, that has you know, done some activity and activism and work on this issue. So at the federal level, too, you know, we also need to look at immigration. The de facto minimum legal age for a U.S. citizen to sponsor a spouse for a visa for a marriage is 18, but it's kind of a convoluted thing. It's not kind of set, that age isn't set in stone in the statutory language. It's more of you cannot contract with the government and sign the forms saying you're going to be able to support that spouse to enable you to petition for the visa unless you're 18. And right now there is no set minimum for a foreign spouse minimum age. And we do know that, you know, when the State Department is looking at granting visas, they look at the ages of individuals, but then they look at the age of marriage that is valid in the state where that couple is going to reside. And given the varying age of marriage across the United States and different states, and how exceptions can lower that age from 18 to, you know, sometimes significantly lower, it is a complex process and one that we need to look at a little bit more closely. So let's turn to the states. As I just mentioned, you know, we have 50 different states with 50 different laws on how and when people can marry. Even though there's no law per se against forced marriage at the federal level, every state has the requirement of consent. Both parties have to consent to a marriage for that marriage to be viewed as valid in that state. You know, in almost every state, I think there's one or two exceptions, the minimum legal age to marry is 18 for two, you know, kind of individuals acting on their own, freely consenting adults. But in many states, that age will lower when there's parental or judicial consent, and sometimes it lowers significantly. Many states it'll lower to 16. In some states, I think New Hampshire, it's 14 for boys and 13 for girls. There's some states that have no minimum age of marriage. California, I think, has no minimum age of marriage with judicial consent. And this is the problem. We worked on a case, we had a client who, she was underage, and she was brought to the licensing office, the registrar's office in her county, where you get the marriage license, you prove your age, you get the required documentation. But her parents were standing right behind her. So yes, they were there, they were consenting to the marriage, she was crying, she did not want to go through with the marriage. The clerk was completely not prepared to deal with this, and you know, he's not an advocate, he didn't intervene, the marriage papers got issued, everyone signed the forms, and that was a forced marriage situation. So we need to think about not just the age per se, but the practices and the protocols that are in place that can really influence, you know, what protections there are for someone that might be facing a forced marriage in this country. Interestingly, though, forced marriage is a criminal offense in about 10 jurisdictions around the United States. And statutes are really geared to prevent prostitution, pandering, protect female virtue. Many of these laws are very old, sometimes over 100 years old. And so while we've done some legal research and we haven't seen them be used very frequently, if at all, for the types of situations we're talking about now, it can still be a tool, though. And we've seen ourselves and advocates that we work with, sharing with a victim, okay, forced marriage is against the law, then if they feel it's going to work for them, take that knowledge and say they're fighting with their parents or negotiating with their parents, to be able to say, in this state, this is against the law. Sometimes that can be a very powerful thing. So turning to further analysis of what we have to work with at the state level, I do think it's important to point out, though, that even in states where forced marriage isn't per se a crime, there are statutes that cover lots of different types of behavior. For example, battery, assault, kidnapping, false imprisonment, things of that nature, stalking, that might cover actions that are being taken by family members in forced marriage situations. We have a few caveats on the slide, though, that I think are really important to acknowledge as well, though. In our experience, victims are usually very, very hesitant to involve, let alone law enforcement, but the court system into the situation. They're scared of what the consequences might be to themselves, their family members. A case I worked on, the individual had 3 young siblings, and she didn't want those siblings to go to a foster home. She didn't want her parents to, lose their status and, return to their home country, the family to be broken apart. These are really weighty considerations that are oftentimes kind of holding clients back and holding them down when they're deciding what options to pursue. We've also seen cases where involvement of courts can increase the risk to the victim. That kind of needs to be looked at a case-by-case basis, particularly if the court's response is not robust enough. If something, protection order is issued, but it's not going to be enforced, where does that lead a victim? Where does that leave them in terms of safety? And here in the United States, there is a great deal of intersection between our criminal law and our immigration law. For many of our clients, if, say, they're a U.S. citizen, but their parents are legal permanent residents, taking a protection order out against those parents and the risk that if the parents violate the protection order, they could be subject to deportation, that adds a whole nother layer of potential harm to that family that client is having to grapple with. So these are important things to keep in mind. We also, do see that there are current, civil protection remedies that are available, specifically looking at what in each state might be available in terms of protection orders. Some states have a more unified system. There's one type of protection order that covers lots of situations. Some states have 4 or 5, 6, 8 types of protection orders, and it gets very, very specific. Within all of these different protection order regimes, the one thing we notice is that rarely do the requirements cover the full range of forced marriage dynamics. For example, harkening back to some of Casey's examples, if the parents aren't the ones pulling the strings, but it's uncle overseas who's forcing the marriage to go through, or even just doesn't live in the same home as the family, is that person able to even be subjected to a domestic violence protection order in that state? What if the relief we need is, not a no-contact order, but that the court will take someone's passports to prevent the family from traveling overseas, or that a child be placed in, a temporary kind of guardianship situation so that there's time to work out what's going on, and for the court to get involved, Child Protection Services, guardian ad litem, others to get involved to really unpack what the best option is going to be for that child that's facing a forced marriage, either here in the U.S. or, and these are the higher stakes cases, if there's a flight risk and the family may go overseas. We need to think creatively about this, and I think, we have a good example in the UK. They have passed a specific forced marriage protection order that gives great leeway to both who can petition for it, who can ask the court for this type of remedy, what kinds of remedies can be pursued, what things can be included in the order, and who the order can be taken out against. And so that's something that we're researching and we look to as a model for future protection orders here in the United States. Children also face a lot of hurdles when they are in forced marriage situations. I think we've actually discussed most of these as we've gone through our prior slides. Casey gave the great example of, child protection services protocols of getting a report of abuse and then calling the family or visiting the family, actually triggering flight or triggering a great deal of pressure being put on that minor so they retract or change their story. We need to be aware of this because unless there's kind of safe and comprehensive protocols and plans put in place to get that child out of the dangerous situation, you may be increasing the risk by by going through the current systems. We also see a lot of times that minors may not know or have capacity to initiate any kind of action with the court. And I will say, it's interesting. When we're working with adults, I think there's great reluctance oftentimes to get law enforcement or the courts involved. And sometimes that is not a big deal because they can access services. With minors, we often find that we have to get the court systems involved in order to be able to let them go to a safe place, get out of a dangerous situation, get out of the family home. And so, access to courts does become a big deal if you're working with children. And the last few bullets do speak to this as well, that kind of barriers to seeking help and barriers to shelter and housing in this country. Unfortunately, in most states, minors cannot access shelters, oftentimes maybe for 24 hours, but at the end of that 24-hour period, shelter staff has to, under state law, notify Child Protection Services or the child's legal guardian, and we've already talked to how that can lead to more problems. There's been a brief discussion about reluctant sponsors. I will just say that reluctant sponsor situations can be pretty complex, and again, it's an issue, and this is a theme that runs through this presentation, of current systems we have not being set up to respond to forced marriage situations. There are ways to withdraw a visa. If you've been forced to sponsor a visa for someone, you can write to Citizenship and Immigration Services and say, please stop that visa. But as I have had experience with, I was working with a client who had been forced to go abroad, forced to marry, allowed to return home, forced to then sponsor a visa. Her family took care of all the paperwork she was forced to sign, sent it in. If she would have just written in and asked for that visa to be canceled, USCIS automatic processes would have kicked out a letter that said, thank you so much for withdrawing the visa. It is now withdrawn. And that letter would have been sent to the address on file, which was her parents' house. And Dad kept the mailbox under lock and key. So he would have immediately known that she was trying to stop the visa, and we were in the middle of trying to plan for her safe relocation from the family home as well. So we do have some excellent colleagues at CIS that we're working with that we can flag forced marriage situations with, but it's not a systemic thing yet. It's still more of a case-by-case basis. And people are often, also fearful of, will there be charges of immigration fraud? What's going to happen to perpetrators in these types of situations? And those are considerations we need to keep in mind as well. So I realize we've gone a couple minutes over, and these are my last two slides, promise. We did want to just preview, though, for participants in the webinar, what Tahirih is trying to do right now, and what not just ourselves, but allies all around this country are pushing for as we try to address forced marriage in the United States. We are really pushing right now for a comprehensive national action plan and for federal government leadership on this issue. We think that having a national action plan will really jumpstart response to this, get federal agencies involved, give state and local level agencies license to be able to handle these types of cases, not feel like they're falling outside of their mandate, better educate Child Protection Services, law enforcement, and other frontline responders around the country. We actually have a petition right now on change.org. If you look up petition to end forced marriage in the United States, change.org, you will find it. And it's a petition to the President that's basically asking that we set up this comprehensive national action plan and convene everyone that needs to be convened to get everyone in the room and begin to talk to some of the proposed solutions that Tahirih is championing. So the actual action plan recommendations include a number of different things. we really think it's critical that we, at the federal level, and loud and clear for people all across the country, increase the understanding that forced marriage should fall under the rubric of family violence, and forced marriage victims should get service under family violence prevention, response, and services programs. We need to ensure that federal funding streams, local funding streams, foundations all realize that this work is a critical component of a response to family violence here in the United States. We also need to be sure that there's new funding for forced marriage-specific resources and programs. We've had a few questions today, like what, who can we go to for X for Y? Is anyone dealing specifically with the intersection of LGBTQ issues and forced marriage? We need more programs to have the capacity to do that, and to do that we need specific grants, specific funding streams, specific hotlines, and tools for frontliners to use to respond to these types of situations. We also need to ensure that there are civil protection orders that can be accessed by forced marriage victims. And we're actually engaged in drafting legislation right now that's looking to the UK forced marriage protection order as a model. And then we'll be hopefully testing this in a state or two and working on a plan for national rollout for a forced marriage protection order that will better meet the needs of individuals in such situations in the U.S. We also need to really look at how we can strengthen state laws on the age of consent to marry. And what do I mean by that? As I said, most states set 18 as the minimum legal age to marry. But, but we have these exceptions, widely ranging across different states that can really lower this age and that don't offer protections because they're concerned about parental consent. They're concerned about Romeo and Juliet situations and not about situations of forced marriage. So what Tahirih is advocating is to set the legal age of marriage at 18 or above in all states and to really eliminate parental consent waivers and to have the only waivers to be available be those that are given by a family court judge after a hearing, and that 16 is set as a floor nationwide for marriage in the United States. The next bullet, implement safeguards in federal immigration laws for marriage-based visas. This involves a number of different factors. So to really address vulnerabilities and to increase access to protection in cases involving forced marriage, we are pushing for a minimum age requirement of 18 for both U.S. citizen sponsors and for foreign beneficiaries of both fiancé and spouse visa applications. And we think that we need to improve education. There's already an advisory pamphlet that is being distributed about domestic violence, rights, resources in the U.S. for people who are getting marriage-based visas. Information about forced marriage should be included in that as well. And we also need to look at how different consular posts around the world are handling visa interviews, adjudications, and to be sure that there are ways for people to identify if they're facing a forced marriage and then get help, not be kind of left in a lurch if they're brave enough to identify being in that type of situation. And then this last prong, ensure that criminal justice options are available to forced marriage victims. As I've noted, in our experience, very few forced marriage victims have any interest in pursuing criminal charges because they're afraid of the consequences to their families and themselves. On the other hand, though, without a specific forced marriage offense, sometimes law enforcement and other entities feel that they don't have the mandate or the authority to be assisting victims. So what we're proposing is that we need to work to be sure that when victims are reaching out to access protection and justice from courts, from prosecutors, from police, and that what they're experiencing is not dismissed as a family issue, as a private matter, or as a cultural issue. This needs to be something that's considered family violence. And we need to be sure that law enforcement, other entities around the U.S. are educated so that they understand that forced marriage situations can involve acts or pressures that do constitute crimes in their state. And again, as I've stated, such as assault, rape, kidnapping, and also so that people know that forced marriage is a specific offense in 10 different jurisdictions. And finally, under this prong, I think it's very, very critical that advocates and policymakers really evaluate where and when there might be gaps in the criminal justice system. And before we create new approaches, such as a new blanket forced marriage law, there needs to be extensive consultation with key experts, with stakeholders, not just within federal agencies and lawmakers, but within affected communities, with frontline responders, with advocacy organizations, to really understand crucial kind of lessons learned from experiences on the ground here in the U.S. and also from other Western countries like the UK, Canada, that are grappling with this issue so we can avoid any unintended consequences to victims. So with that all said, I just want to say, and again, another huge thank you for joining us today. Especially as we've gone over just slightly 10 minutes. It actually might be a record. Our webinars usually go quite over. We're very excited to have you all, join the conversation with us today, and we encourage you to continue being part of the conversation around how to end forced marriage in the U.S. As you can see, you can sign up for our National Network to Prevent Forced Marriage, or if you're interested in joining our core forced marriage working group, which is made up of advocates, survivors, agencies from all over the U.S. You can visit our website, or you can email or call either Casey or myself directly. So thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you today.